Welcome to this recording on making job sites successful for students. This was a job coach training that was completed at the paraprofessional training at ESU 13 in August of 2016. I will do my best to make it as interactive as possible through webinar format, but right now what I'm going to show you is basically the presentation that I did at this paratraining. And the goal is to create passion-driven job experiences. The key to making job sites successful for all learners is ensuring that passion is the key to it. Making sure that students have interest in what they're doing. The key things that we have to remember when trying to have a successful placement is to ensure that the job meets the student's skill and interest. And we have to remember that we have to define supports. We have to connect jobs and supports together to make it a fully encompassing job experience. And the key really is to start at the top with assessing their skills and interest and ensuring that passion drives that job placement, because students are far more willing to participate and to make sure that they attend if they have an interest and a stake in the job. And that varies for every single student. So it's important that we learn how to define a successful placement. And how do we do this? How do we know what students really want? And how do we know what we need to give them? How do we know how to make things successful? That's going to be the first part of what we talk about today. Why do I want to know where they're at? Why do I need to know that? And what do I have to do? The first step is identifying their interests, knowing that the job that they are at has some relation to their hopes and desires. And a lot of times I do hear, okay, well, what if they want to be a professional wrestler? Well, the key thing is we have to talk to kids and get them to understand, okay, what would your option be? You've got to eat. So how are you going to earn that money while you're working towards that larger goal? And getting them to understand that a goal is what their values are right now. And so what are their interests? What are their values? What are their goals for their jobs? And once we get that key, that right there is critical to making sure that we have a successful job placement. We can't just place students in a job that is available for them, because they may not be interested. And then we may have concerns, and then we may have an overlying statement of individual is unable to communicate with coworkers. Individual refuses to do tasks. We have to remember that if they have an interest in it, they are highly more likely to make sure that they're participating and that they're doing what is asked of them. The second thing we have to remember is identify the outside factors that may help or hinder a student's career pursuits. Some of those outside factors might be their family supports, getting their family behind it, or getting people that they know to be able to be around them to make it a better experience. Identifying what may hinder that doesn't mean that it will hinder it and stops the process from happening, but making sure that we look at what could impede success within that job. And it's not just success while we, the job coach, are there, but success in the future, because our whole goal for all students is to ensure that they have an independent placement that they could pursue on their own one day. And so if that's our goal, we have to look at what things could hinder it and how can we make sure that we're giving supports to make sure that that isn't an issue when the student independently works. And another thing that we need to look at is what academic or social supports may that student need in that work environment. So what is needed for success in their work environment? Regardless of a student's area of verification of disability, we can always find ways. And we're going to talk a little bit about changing that yes, but thinking to a set of yes and thinking. And that is a critical piece of being a successful job coach and creating a passion-driven experience. And a final thing that we're going to really look at is how do we engage students to reduce behaviors? If we have successfully looked at students' interest and we have planned for those outside factors and looked at academic or social supports, more than likely this component is going to come with it, and reduced behaviors will be the result. One of the first ways that we can look at assessing interests and abilities is to examine some informal methods that may have been done by the teachers already. Teachers have many assessments that they complete for students. And so in their IEPs, they write this. Now, job coaches are not always able to have a copy of the IEP. That goes to confidentiality purposes. However, any interviews that may have been done with students, any interviews with parents, observations, reading previous reports that might be there, or checklists can be shared verbally, and they can be shared with information, because that is critical to identifying what jobs might be successful. And that's a huge part of a job coach's job experience. So we have to remember that we've got to ask about those. We've got to collaborate when it comes to informal methods. And we want to make sure that we get the perspective and create a person-centered plan at the same time. But then we also have a group of assessments called formal methods, and many teachers do complete these. Nebraska Vocational Rehabilitation will help complete these as well. So collaborating with your case managers and teachers on finding what formal methods were completed and what those things showed are pretty important. We have some picture interest surveys that might show what areas they would be successful at. We have some life skill assessments. And life skills directly go to job skills, because if a student shows mobility concerns within a life skills assessment, we know we might need to put some accommodations and supports in place. Values assessments. What does the student value? If a student really has no value of money, using money as the reinforcement will not be successful, and making the focus of the job about money and pay won't be a successful placement. But if the student's value is to help people, and that student really enjoys helping people, that might help discover a true placement. Because when we reach the heart of the student and we figure out what exactly is their values, and we reach those in the job, then they're happy and they would be successful and have positive behaviors. So we have to remember that values are very critical in this. And teachers may have completed value assessments. We could complete, as job coaches, could complete value assessments with our students. Also, there's other types of video career assessments, career connections, work readiness. All those things require collaboration and discussion with the case managers and teachers. And so it is important to set a time where you would be able to discuss with them what interests and abilities does the student have. Once we identify what the interest is, and we've kind of identified a few places that the student might want to work, we have to look at what barriers might be in place in that employment location. How do we define supports for them? And how do we figure out how we could make that a job that that student could independently complete on their own? And when we look at that, there's 4 key areas that we really need to evaluate. And there may be more that you think of, but we really have to look at transportation and logistics. Yes, we as job coaches may transport them to the job when they're in high school. But when they effectively transition to the adult world, how are they going to get there? If they keep that job, and we want, which is our goal, to get that independence, how are they going to get to work? Is there a bus system? Is there transportation that can take them there? Do they have friends? Do they have family? Those are supports we have to include. When we're planning the hours, if they are relying on their parents, we might want to look around that parent's hours. Even though we're taking them at certain times, we may need to ensure that planning is taking place so that transportation and logistics is taken care of and will smoothly transition into successful independent job placement. Another factor that we need to look at is mobility. Oftentimes, maybe our students might use a wheelchair to access their work environment, or a student might use a walker to access their work environment, or a student might need supports through assistive technology partnership. What mobility factors? We need to identify any hindrances or any positives about businesses when we're looking at them that would really support the mobility of the student. Now, that's not to say that a job should be planned around the mobility, because there are many, many accommodations and interventions and many support systems out there that could help us ensure that mobility is not a factor. So we have to remember that we have to identify them, but we can't let us stop us and use yes, but thinking of yes, but that person can't do that because they can't maneuver through that. The shelf is too high. The things that we can change our thinking to a yes and type, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But we've got to ensure that there are places where maybe mobility will impede it, but we have to try at every extent possible to make sure that mobility would not impede it. We have to look at communication. If our students struggle with communication, or they struggle with reading, excuse me, if they struggle with reading or they struggle with anything else, we have to make sure we set up systems to support them and set up accommodations and modifications for that. We have to make sure that we create visual schedules, that we use video modeling, that we make sure that we give them every opportunity for success through supports that we can provide. And the goal of those, while we're providing them, is to make sure we fade them out, because then the student is allowed to practice independence. And when they practice independence, then it leads to that ultimate goal. That is our goal. Social skills and behavior. Does our student have appropriate social skills or behavior in the workplace? Just because a student might have aggression issues at school, or a student might speak out if they have Tourette's, they might speak out or use different words, inappropriate words. We have many of those students that may do that. We have to remember that there are ways that we can accommodate for that, and we would want to plan jobs around that so that a student would be successful. Because if we put a student at a front office desk and they might say inappropriate words, we know they're going to be dealing with the public, and that probably will not be a successful placement. So we have to keep that in mind, thinking about transportation, thinking about mobility, thinking about communication, and thinking about social skills and behavior. When we plan around those things, we have to change our thinking from a yes but to a yes and. That doesn't mean that just because those factors exist that we can't accommodate and intervene for them. So what we have to think of is, okay, we have to change our thinking. Oftentimes, we would say, but the student has limited mobility with their hand. I don't think they'll be able to answer a phone. That's kind of where our minds go. It's the nature of what we do to problem solve. But what we need to change it to is a yes and. Yes, and we can contact assistive technology to see if that student can have an adaptation for a telephone. Yes, and we can create a touch button answering system. Yes, and that student can also file with the other hand. How can we accommodate that? How can we ensure that supports are effectively in place to make sure that they're there? And changing our thinking from yes but to yes and makes all the difference in the world. And this is a hard process because we're used to saying yes but. So barriers to and solutions to mobility and transportation. I'm going to give you just about a minute to think about that. Think about barriers that you may have had for students in the past that you have supported and job coached for that maybe have some mobility and transportation concerns. And you think about those things. And I'm going to give you a couple examples in the next slide. And in the actual presentation, we all shared them. So kind of think about them in your head and be creative. So here's a couple of scenarios to kind of really get your thought process going on the yes and yes type of thinking. Remember that the key is to switch us to a yes and thinking and to get rid of the but. No more buts around. And when we change that, it takes a while. And what we did is we listed things. So a young adult that uses a wheelchair to access their working environment is working in the library. Automatically, people in the training would say, yes, but the student wouldn't be able to reach the top shelf. Yes, but how is the student going to push a cart? Yes, but. And instead of saying that yes, but thinking, we're going to switch it to yes, and. Yes, and we can contact assistive technology to see if there is a cart that could be adapted to a wheelchair. Yes, and we might be able to get a device for the student to be able to reach the top shelf. Yes, and the student could easily sit at the desk, front desk, and check out books in and out. Yes, and the student could read to young children. Yes, and the student could ensure that rooms are prepared for presentations. So we think of alternatives and we think of all the things that a student can do, as opposed to the yes, but thinking of stopping our process of, oh, well, they just can't work in a library because of this. And that is a hard process. But when you really look at all of the things, break it down by tasks in the library. What can they do? And how can we adapt to them? And also, I don't think we should always keep yes, and they can have a support person who reaches the top shelf. Because remember that our goal is to have them be 100% independent on that job so that they could do it. Our goal might be to have them 60% independent. It depends on what your goals are. But we want to remember that we want to try to achieve the greatest level of independence possible. And so in the second one, a young adult that accesses a walker for support is working at Pizza Hut. Some people might say, yes, but the student wouldn't be able to bus tables. Yes, but the counters are too high. But instead, we change our thinking to yes, and we might be able to, under ADA compliance, have a lower preparation table. Yes, and we might be able to have the student bag the wings in a different location. Yes, and we might be able to have assistive technology help us with a tray carrier. So all of these things, yes, and the student can be a host and seat people. Yes, and the student can carry things over to the salad bar and possibly switch them out depending on the height. So we have to remember that it isn't about stopping the process. If the student really has a desire to work in either of these locations, we need to figure out a way to help them at the greatest extent possible. So when we look at barriers, it's not always mobility barriers that we have. Many of us have some barriers to communication. So think for a minute or two on barriers to communication that you might have. You might have a nonverbal student. You might have someone who doesn't really understand the receptive communication weakness stops them from understanding multi-step directions. You might have a student who doesn't always express themselves well or really struggles to talk with social anxiety to other people. So what we have to remember is, if we had a young adult who accesses a hearing aid and they're answering telephones in a reservation call center, some people might say, yes, but that's not possible. But we could say, yes, and there are assistive tech devices to help that student. Yes, and we have so many things nowadays that actually will be able to convert text to speech to text. So there are options there. Now I give you that example because that is a tough one. That is a really tough one to look at. But there is always a yes and. There's always a yes and. Yes, and the student could run the receiver switch with blinking lights. Yes, and telephones do have blinking lights to show them that a call is incoming. So there are different things that we can do. And that scenario gives you a good example of how you really have to kind of dig deeper for that yes and thinking. A young adult that is nonverbal is working in a job that requires them to occasionally answer questions from customers. Yes, and we can create conversation cards. Yes, and we can teach them scripted speech. Yes, and we can work with them and role play and model those situations ahead of time. Yes, and we can identify stressful scenarios that will come up that they would be prepared for. Yes, and while we're there, we can prompt them. But remember, independence is the goal. So we want them to be independent, but they're going to need our support. Yes, and we can use video modeling to show them the situations that happen. And even if we use video modeling, I would, in this situation, definitely recommend to do it within the location, the job location. So these are just a couple examples that shows you to change that yes but thinking to yes and thinking. and barriers and solutions to social skills and behavior concerns. And I know that this is probably one of the more challenging areas to switch your thinking from yes but to yes and. Because if you have a student who is diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, they shout out, they swear, they're going to do that. And you know that they can't necessarily stop that. You can teach them some self-regulation, but it may happen. And they're working in a job requiring them to work with people. That is a very tough one, because that gives a really good example of how we have to dig deep sometimes. So what we want to remember is, yes, and we can provide training. Yes, and we can do some video modeling experiences. Yes, and we can use prompting. Yes, and the student can create self-prompts. Because there are ways for individuals to turn it into an alternative. So when we're doing that, we have to remember that it's not a but concept, that we have to think of that. And it may not be the best setting for them. And we'll find that through all of our evaluation. But the key thing there is remembering to change it from yes, but to yes, and. A young adult that becomes violent when frustrated has a job requiring multiple step directions. That one, I think, comes a little easier because the individual has a definite antecedent and it's multiple step directions. So we want to look at that antecedent and try to see how we can reduce that. How do we accommodate that? So the yes and provides those accommodations. So yes, and we could provide a visual schedule. Yes, and we can have the student repeat it to us and practice echolalic directions so that they know them and they're clear on them. Yes, and we can use role playing and video modeling. Yes, and they can write out the directions themselves so that they can process it. Yes, and it goes on and on. We can provide interventions and support, but we want to fade them in time so that the student can learn to do those things independently. But in the beginning, we may need to provide those visual cues. We may need to provide those visual supports. But our goal there is to reduce that antecedent that causes that violent, frustrated behavior. And that means that we have to provide an alternative to multiple step directions. Whether that student needs to repeat them, whether that student needs to do those things, we have to change it from yes, but that person shouldn't work with customers. Yes, and in order to work with customers, the person needs a very clear schedule. Yes, and they can work in this environment. They can work with people. So we have to change our yes, but thinking to a yes, and strategy. When we do that, we can help put supports in place that overcome those barriers, working together with employers to overcome barriers to provide a successful working situation. When we're working with employers, there's a few critical things that I really want to talk about. Do we disclose? An employer only needs to know as much as it affects the job. It's the same thing if we look in the Americans with Disabilities Act and disclosure. If it is going to affect the job, the employer needs to be aware of it. But if a student is verified with a learning disability and they take a little extra processing time, it doesn't need to be disclosed until it may become an issue. So what we have to remember is we have to be cautious about what we disclose. We don't want to give way too much information. We don't want to give any and all of the stuff that we possibly can give them and that we are aware of. Because the employer should view them as an equal employee as much as possible. Is it our place to disclose for the student? Or should the student be with us when we talk to the employer? We have to remember that our students have a right to disclose. They have the right to say what they want to share. Some students, on the flip side, we have to guide them on the appropriate level of disclosure. Because some of our students do like to make them very aware of some of the things. So when we had our job interviews for the grant, we had a lot of students that came in and they shared with us as the interviewing committee, and the employer was there, that they have right away, out of the gate, 5 minutes, they shared, I have autism, it makes me think different. And that's great because we were teaching them self-determination in school. But what we have to remember is to remind students that there is a certain level of disclosure that we want to share in the workplace. That might be private things too, and it may not have anything to do with the verified disability. It might be something as simple as what they ate in the morning, just talking to them about what do we want to disclose about ourselves and what circle are we in that we need to share that. But the key thing that I want everyone to take away from this is that when communicating with employers, we need to be really cautious about disclosure. And I do have some articles and some material on that if you do watch this webinar and you would like some. Because it is kind of a dance and it's a hard call because they need to know that our individuals do have disabilities. And they pretty much know that when we come out and we introduce ourselves. But we don't need to be specific. We don't. And this summer during the grant, we were questioned by one of the employees that the individual was paired with. And she, out of caring, she asked, can I ask what she's diagnosed with? And we said to her, we are not at liberty to disclose that. If she chooses to disclose that with you, then that is absolutely fine. But it is her choice and she needs to be the one to disclose it. So we just have to be cautious about how much we share, especially with coworkers, because the students' coworkers, unless they are directly supporting the student or anyone else, the information that is shared with them is very minimal. So we need to remember that unless it directly affects the job, we should not be disclosing for our students. In addition to disclosure, we've got to look at the schedule. And sometimes our schedule is dictated by our class schedules in high school. Sometimes our schedules are dictated on what days that the employer might need someone. The length. It might be a job that only requires an hour to an hour and a half. It might be a job that doesn't have any breaks if they're there an hour and a half. Or you might need to put breaks in for the student. Talking to the employer about these things will definitely help out. And if you have a student who gets frustrated easily with multi-step directions, they might need breaks. If it's a student who needs to be redirected often, they might need breaks. So we just have to kind of plan for that, talk to the employers, and make sure that we're looking at the time involved. Then we have to look at the environment. Do we need to make any adaptations to the environment? Because if we're doing that, we need to talk to the employer about it. If the student needs a device to help them answer the phone, or needs flashing lights, or they need some other method for communication support in the environment, we need to talk to the employer because we would be adjusting their work environment. If they need visual supports, if it's just a visual schedule, the employer might not need to know. But remember that our goal is independence. So if we want our student to be successful, the manager might need to know about the visual schedules because they might need to keep them or even make them when they have something different. The tasks that we do, we might need to create lists. We might need to have those visual schedules. We might need to create those things that are in our environment, and our employer does need to be aware of those things. So the key thing is remembering that if we look at our students' interests, and we examine the supports that are necessary within the work environment, and we have that communication and that open line with our employers, and really establish that good relationship, that our students will have successful, passion-driven experiences. And that's our whole goal for them. And so what I want you to remember from this webinar is those three things of making sure that we're planning for that, and that interests drive all of those experiences, and their passions drive those experiences. If you have any questions, I'm always available at pbrzezinski@esu13.org or 308-630-6506. Thank you for listening today.